Now let's compute the monetary outputs, the costs. Okay. So hiring cost will be, you take the workers hired, multiply by hiring cost per worker, which is right there. Firing cost will be number of workers fired times the firing cost. Okay, regular time wages is from number of workers. So workers available after hiring and firing times their wage per regular wages per worker per month. Number of workers available after hiring and firing and regular wages. Okay. Overtime wages is paid based on the actual hours used. So overtime hours times overtime wage rate per hour. Okay. Raw material cost is how many shoes we're going to produce times the raw material cost per pair of shoes. Holding cost is inventory, how much inventory, ending inventory we have, times holding cost per pair of shoes in inventory per month. And then you sum all that and you get the sum of the cost for month 1. Of course, we can then copy it across like this. And if you sum row wise, that will give you the sum of, that will give you the total of each category of costs. Okay. Then of course when you sum the sums, that will give us the objective to minimize. So this is our objective to minimize. Before we run solver, let's give some names. So we need names for workers hired and fired. We need overtime labor and maximum labor for setting up the constraint. Okay, then we need shoes produced and production capacity. Okay, we need inventory after production and forecasted demand. And we need the total cost, and here there is no label by the side, so we have to define name. Total cost. So now we can go to solver. We want to minimize that, and the changing cells are workers hired, workers fired, overtime labor we'll be using, and how many shoes we're going to produce. And the constraints are overtime labor should be less than or equal to the overtime constraint. Shoes produced must be less than or equal to the capacity. And inventory after production must be greater than or equal to forecasted demand. Okay, so now we change this to simplex, non-negative. So now we solve. We found a solution. Okay. Now we need to make sure that everything is okay. Well, there is a problem here. the solution says we have to fire 6.25 workers, which is not possible. We have to have whole numbers for this. So let's go back into solver and add one more constraint. So that will be workers hired must be integer and workers fired must be integer. Okay, and we'll solve again. Okay, now check back, and now it seems all right. So here is the hiring and firing plan. This is the plan for how many overtime hours will be scheduled, and this is the production plan. It will give you these inventories, and these will be the costs. Once we have the optimum aggregate production plan, there are lots of different sensitivity analysis that are possible. You can look at the sensitivity of all of these different costs. We can look at the sensitivity of the standard hours needed and sensitivity of the demands being different. Okay, all of that can be done one by one. Now we'll look at one such sensitivity analysis, and that will be based on overtime wage rate. Right now we are using overtime of 240 hours in month 2, and that's it. Okay, what if the overtime rate is different? Would the amount of overtime that we have to use be different? So go to solver table, run solver table. So we're going to do one-way solver table, and the input cell is the overtime wage rate, which is right there. Okay, and we will use $7 to $21. Okay, so starting from somewhat smaller than the current wage rate and ending up with a lot larger than the current rate, and say in $2 increments. Okay, and we want to look at the overtime usage. Okay, whether the overtime usage will be different, and let's assume that we also want to look at the total cost. Okay, remember we have to do control click, otherwise the previous selection will vanish. Well, it did. Okay, we want to look at overtime, comma, control click. Now click OK, and you see when the overtime, if the overtime cost wage rate is $7 or $9, then we use overtime in the first two cases in month 1. Okay, and a lot more overtime for month 2. But once you hit $11, you use on 240 hours of overtime in month 2 only, and none in other months. And when you hit $21, you don't use any overtime at all. And of course you can plot these by clicking here and changing the y-axis. You can look at a plot for each of the output columns.